Let's talk a little bit about black history, and let's start with a map. This is a map of the area around the Mediterranean Sea. Up here we have Europe. Here's Africa. I think you can see on your screens that in this area of Africa that I'm pointing to is a desert. This, of course, is the Sahara Desert. The territory to the north is fertile, and the territory to the south is fertile. In fact, it's very fertile. Now let's talk about empires. The first great empire in Western civilization was probably Egypt, over here. Not much is known about the early Egyptian empire. There's lots of speculation. But in the process of time, the empire passed. Israel was great for a short time, but that didn't last either. Now, I don't have to tell you that a great empire arose in Greece. Most historians of intellectual Western history trace the history of Western intellectualism to Greece. Now, the Greek Empire didn't last too long, a number of centuries. One could reasonably ask why Greece became so great and why it was unable to hold on to its greatness. One could write whole books on that subject, and I'm sure that lots of such books have been written. But the fact of the matter is that for whatever reason, the Greek Empire rose, the Greek Empire fell. Subsequently, Western civilization moved over here to Italy. That's, of course, what we now call the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire at its peak stretched from Spain all the way around the Mediterranean, encompassing Arabia and parts of northern Africa. The Roman Empire lasted longer than just about any other, better part of 1,000 years. But in the process of time, Rome passed as well. There was a Persian Empire, which had its roots over here in Persia, actually over here, Iran. The Persian Empire at its peak stretched from Egypt, encompassing most of the Middle East, just about up to Greece. And the Persian Empire passed as well. The end of the Persian Empire came, I guess around the year 640 or so, when the armies of Muhammad began to conquer the Middle East, a process which was completed with lightning rapidity. So the next great empire was the Empire of Islam, an empire which, in many respects, has not ended to this day. It arose in Saudi Arabia, immediately conquered the entire Middle East, conquered Persia. The Persian Empire was Zoroastrian in religion. They got rid of that, replaced it with Islam. They tried desperately to get into Europe at this end and failed, but what they did do was they came across North Africa, and North Africa fell to the Muslims. It fell quickly, so that by the year 710, they were over here at the Straits of Gibraltar. That was only, about 60 years after the death of Muhammad. It took them only 60 years to conquer the entire Middle East and get over to this point right here. This puts us at the year 710 AD. Now, in the year 710 AD, a fellow by this name, let's get him to stand up a little better, Tariq ibn Ziyad, means Tariq, the son of Ziyad. Tariq was, I believe, a Moroccan. This is Morocco over here. In other words, he was a Moor, a man from Morocco. This whole North African empire, Islamic empire, came to be called the Moors, or in Shakespeare, the Blackamoors. Sounds like we had some black people there, huh? Tariq took the armies of Islam across the Straits of Gibraltar and landed on the Rock in the year 710 AD. You'll never guess what he did next. He burned the boats. He made up his mind that if his armies of Islam could not conquer Spain, they weren't going home. So he burned the damn boats, and that left them facing one way, which was straight forward. And in the year 710, they swept across the Iberian Peninsula, and they took the land that we now call Spain for Islam. For just about 800 years, until precisely the year 1492, the year Columbus sailed for America. For almost 800 years, Spain was a Muslim country. The armies stopped at the Pyrenees Mountains because they couldn't beat the French. In honor of his conquest, they called what is now called the Rock of Gibraltar Jabal al-Tariq, which means the Mountain of Tariq. And the British, in their inimitable way, turned Jabal al-Tariq into Gibraltar. We now had an African Muslim empire which stretched from the Pyrenees Mountains, encompassing all of Spain, Morocco, and the whole north coast of Africa right up to Egypt, and the area south into the Sahara Desert as far as any man cared to stake a claim. This northern African empire, which was eventually headquartered in Spain, went under three names, and here they are. All the same empire, really, but three different names. From 710, the year that the Muslims moved into Spain, up until about the time of the Crusades, this was called the Umayyad Empire. And it wasn't just North Africa, because at that time, up until the Crusades, Islam had a world government. It was one empire, ruled from Damascus, and it was called the Umayyad Empire. But around the time of the Crusades, the Umayyad Empire fell apart into smaller empires. And the empire encompassing Spain and North Africa at that point was called the Almoravid Empire, later the Almohad Empire. These names, Almoravid and Almohad, come from names of tribes, but it was all basically the same region. This area, from Spain, North Africa, all the way to Egypt and well into the Sahara Desert, an area just about the size of Western Europe. Now, around the time of the Crusades, Islam made its way across the Sahara Desert into this fertile sub-Saharan region, and a second Islamic empire arose down here. This empire also went under different names, and here are the names. Originally it was called Ghana, but not the Ghana of today. A huge mass of land, which we're going to show you again in a minute. Later it came to be called the Kingdom of Mali. And finally, at around the time of Columbus, it was called the Kingdom of Songhai, Songhai being the name of an African tribe which conquered the territory. Three different names, but all really the same kingdom. A kingdom comprising the area from Senegal over here, all the way across the fertile sub-Saharan region to Chad, and well into the Sahara Desert. Again, an area almost the size of Western Europe. Now, I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but I'm pointing now to a river. This river flows from the mountains coming originally from Senegal, first east and then south. It's called the Niger River. And along the shores of the Niger River arose a civilization which eventually became the center of civilization in the Western world. Its headquarters was here. This is a city called Timbuktu. To those of you who are not familiar with this history, it might sound a little like a joke. Timbuktu. Timbuktu, at the time that Columbus sailed for America, was the center of Western civilization. Right here in the heart of Africa, on the shores of the Niger River. In other words, this was a city of niggers, some people would like to call them. But they outdid Whitey. Europe at this time was a mess. There was no real civilization to speak of. The Renaissance was just starting at the time that Timbuktu, down in the heart of so-called darkest Africa, was the center of world civilization. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? Not only is it possible, it was true. And if you don't believe it, look it up in any encyclopedia. Historians straight enough get away with this. This cult facts of history involves would just as soon not think about it. Now, before proceeding, I want to show you a few books. This book is called From Babylon to Timbuktu, written by Rudolf Windsor. I've spoken to Rudolf Windsor a few times. He's a great writer, and he takes the history of the sub-Saharan black empires as well as the northern Saharan black empires and makes them very readable. All the information in this book can be verified in any encyclopedia, but it's more interesting to read it here. Because Mr. Windsor is a sponsor of this show, we're going to be giving the address of his publishing company at the end. You can also obtain this book in many black bookstores or street stalls which cater to black books, although you won't necessarily be able to find this in Barnes & Noble. Great book. Here's another book which is a big source of information for me. It's called World's Great Men of Color And this is a book you shouldn't have too much trouble finding in a library or elsewhere. It was written by J.A. Rogers, one of the great black writers of the early 20th century. Finally, here's a book that I'd love to be able to talk about, but I doubt there'll be time. It's called The Sign and the Seal by Graham Hancock. It was a bestseller for its genre not too long ago. It tells the story of the Ark of the Covenant. And if you're like me, by the time you finish this book, you're going to believe, as the author believes, that the Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia, where it's been for thousands of years. That is, God, if Mr. Hancock is correct, gave the Ark of the Covenant to niggers. Think about that. Of course, a lot of people don't believe that. I'm not 100% sure it's true myself, but I'm about 90% convinced. In any event, I don't think we're going to have time to talk about the Ark today. Let's talk about Spain during the Middle Ages. I want to read something to you. I want to read you a little passage about Moorish Spain as Europe's cultural center. Although the white Christians of Spain deeply desired, during this entire period, to expel the blackamoors from their country, it is nevertheless an undisputed historical fact that medieval Spain was the cultural, educational, and scientific center of Europe. The Moorish kings lived in castles of highly polished marble, with elaborately carved walls and beautiful mosaic floors, while European kings lived in cold, damp castles of unfinished stone, crude by comparison. The streets of Spain's capital city, Córdoba, were well paved and completely illuminated by public lights, at a time when the streets of London were dark and covered with mud. The Moors possessed all the knowledge of ancient Greece, which was lost to Europe until the Renaissance. They made important contributions to philosophy, medicine, mathematics, chemistry, astronomy, and botany. Doesn't sound like such a dark age after all, does it? There were academies for the rich, free schools for the poor, and libraries containing books from all over the world. The Jews of medieval Spain got along famously with the Muslims, and for them the sojourn in that nation is remembered as being the second most glorious period in their history, exceeded only by the glory of the reigns of David and Solomon in ancient Israel. Medieval Spain was the time and place of Maimonides and many of the other great Old Testament scholars whose works constitute the foundations of modern Jewish thought. Throughout the Middle Ages, the white Christians of Spain endeavored to thrust out the Moors. It took them until 1492 to do that. When Isabella and Ferdinand finally defeated the last Moorish king in Granada, in the same year that they financed Columbus's trip to America, they immediately expelled all Jews who refused to accept Christianity. This is not at all surprising. Since the Jews had actively supported the Moorish conquests, the Christians were not about to take any chances on losing what had taken them 800 years to regain. The day the last Moors and Jews were expelled from Spain was counted as a great day in Spanish history. But was it? It's true that Spain, largely through the strength of its navy, had achieved the status of a world power. But in less than a century, the Spanish Armada was defeated by England, and the nation went into a great decline. Now we're going to ask a very important question. During the Middle Ages, were Spain's Muslim rulers really black? It's almost inevitable that white people who have never been taught black history will ask this question. Were they really black? After all, Moors are kind of Arabic. They're not really Negro, are they? And the answer to the question is that there was more than one race involved. Again, as I told you before, in the beginning there was the Umayyad dynasty, and they were mainly Arabic, although there were some blacks there. But by about the time of the Crusades, the Umayyad dynasty became soft and complacent, and the forces of Christianity were rising up in Spain and threatening to overthrow Islam. A second dynasty of kings arose called the Almoravids. They came out of Senegal, which is right in the middle of Africa. That's about as black as you can get. They conquered Spain, and they were the rulers from then until the end. Centuries. There's no question that Spain was ruled by blacks, at least during the latter part of the Middle Ages. The third dynasty, the Almohads, was also a mixed dynasty. The greatest of the Almohad kings was a fellow who they called Al-Mansur, which means the Invincible. His actual name was Yaqub ibn Yusuf, which means Jacob, son of Joseph. Almost like a Jewish name. Al-Mansur arose at a time when the Christian forces were really rearing up and threatening to expel Islam. The Christians put together a huge army of 300,000 men at a place called Alarcos. Al-Mansur called together all the forces of Islam from all across North Africa, all the way to Egypt, and put together an army which beat the Christians at Al-Alarcos in one of the greatest battles in history. Now, Al-Mansur was the son of a man who was described as being of mixed race, but his mother was a full-blooded Negro slave from Senegal or Timbuktu. That makes Al-Mansur at least 75% Negro. And that's about as colored as any black man walking the streets of America today. So the answer to the question is yes, Spain was ruled by blacks during the period when it was indisputably the cultural, scientific, and educational center of Europe, believe it or not. Now the slightly out of focus map on the left-hand side of your screen shows the approximate boundaries of the medieval Great Black Sub-Saharan Kingdom, known variously as Ghana, and then Mali, and later Songhai, all the same kingdom, a rather large kingdom. The yellow color shows the modern nation of Mali, which is, of course, much smaller. And right in the midst of it is a large black arrow showing the location of Timbuktu, the greatest city of that nation. I'd like to read you something about Timbuktu. This kingdom was originally called the Kingdom of Ghana. From about 300 AD up to the time of the Crusades, Ghana was a Jewish nation. This has been documented by the writings of one Eldad the Danite, whose works constitute the main historical source of information for this time or place. So this was a Jewish kingdom. Did you know that there were Jewish kingdoms in Africa? After North Africa was converted to Islam, an immensely lucrative trade developed between Ghana and the Islamic states to the north. In other words, the empire that was centered in Spain, which we talked about. At first, the Ghanans traded gold, then iron, which was used to make weapons. Eventually, they traded grain, which proved to be the most lucrative of all. Shortly after the year 1000 AD, the kings of Ghana converted to Islam. Subsequently, the city of Timbuktu became the center of trade for the entire world, not just Africa. At that time in history, movement of goods across Europe from land was out of the question, because Europe was a collection of warring barbarian states. So all goods from the east, and that means all goods period, because there weren't nothing being made in the west at that time, all goods from the east were brought to Egypt, where they were loaded onto caravans. The caravan routes all converged at Timbuktu, which, by the 15th century, had become one of the wealthiest cities in the world. From Timbuktu, the goods were transported 1,000 miles to the Atlantic coast, from where they were loaded onto ships bound for Europe. In the 14th century, the University of Sankore was founded at Timbuktu, and this city began to become one of the world's leading centers of academic learning. Ghana, which by then was known as Songhai, came to be known as the Mecca of the Sudan. By the year 1500, this empire in the heart of so-called darkest Africa had become the center of the Islamic world, at a time when the Renaissance in Europe had barely begun. The students of Timbuktu were sent out to the great Muslim universities of Spain, North Africa, and Asia, and the learned men of all races and nationalities were paid handsomely to come into Timbuktu to teach. The commodity which came to be the most profitable object of trade in Timbuktu was not gold or silver or grain, but books. It has been written that there were more books in the library of the University of Sankore than in all the libraries of Europe combined. It is also said that the entire body of male free citizens was literate. Leadership and authority were in hands of the learned scholars of the city. There was a legendary 14th century Muslim traveler named Ibn Battuta. He's kind of like the Marco Polo of the Arab world. And this is what Ibn Battuta had to say about Timbuktu, and I quote, The inhabitants had a greater abhorrence of injustice than any other people. Neither the man who travels nor he who stays at home has anything to fear from robbers or men of violence. The driving force behind these developments was God and nothing else. Timbuktu arose as a Jewish empire and blossomed under the banners of Islam. There's no question about what the source of greatness was, not black skin color, but God. So maybe you're starting to understand what I mean when I say, whoever you thought you were, you're a Jew. We're out of time now. Please tune in next week when we're going to talk about the relationship between God and enlightenment. Are there two different ultimate realities, or are these two the same? Or maybe they're both wrong. If you want to know the answer to the question, tune in next week and find out. Thank you, and goodbye.